Welcome back to the CS161 programming tutorial. In this part of the tutorial, we will be addressing iteration 1 of program development. Iteration 1 objectives include creating an Eclipse Java project, constructing the subset of the GUI you see here. Notice we got the main window, it's titled, and inside the main window we have a single panel, the Actions panel, that has the three action buttons: Apply, Reset, and Exit. We'll also then run this version of the program and verify two things. We're going to verify that we get the correct GUI display as seen here, and also that the event handling that we're going to define for Apply, Reset, and Exit buttons is correct. What you see here is the overall design of the project, and I have shaded in the portion of the design we're going to address in iteration 1. So in iteration 1, we are going to create 5 classes. We're going to create 2 of the view classes, iDoCater and GUI, the Actions panel, 1 of the controller classes, the Actions Event Listener, the model class, reception plan, and our driver, the iDoCatering driver. That's where the main method's going to be. Those classes you see annotated with stars are classes we're going to completely implement in this iteration. The other 2 classes we are going to partially implement. The iteration 1 design section in the programming assignment also gives us some guidance to how each of these classes should be implemented. I've taken that text and reproduced it here on this slide and the following. So with respect to our model class reception plan, we're going to define a data member that does hold a reference to the iDoCatering GUI object. The next part of this sentence I have struck out. We're going to ignore that part of the design, save that for a future iteration. Below that, I have some sentences in italics. The ones in italics are ones we're going to partially implement in this iteration. So we are going to define a method that's eventually going to calculate the values displayed in the reception charges panel. For this iteration, all it's going to do is it's going to notify the iDoCatering GUI that the display has to be updated. The same thing for the reinitialized data members. Okay, we're just going to do that partially, and basically we're just going to do the same thing as with calculating. We're just going to notify the iDoCatering GUI that the display must be updated to show the reinitialized values. For the Actions panel, which is a member of the View class, we are going to implement all of this design. So it's going to hold a reference to a reception plan object, and it's going to hold data members for each J button. There'll be 3 of them. We're going to define a constructor that's going to create and populate the J panel, and we're going to instantiate an Actions Event Listener, and that's going to be the controller for each of our J buttons. So we're going to have one controller instance that's going to be listening for events on 3 different buttons. Sometimes in GUI construction, there's one event listener per GUI control. So here we're having the one instance do kind of not double duty, but triple duty. The Actions Event Listener is that controller class. So it's going to determine then, since it could be any one of the three buttons that was clicked, it has to determine which button was clicked, because it needs to do that to determine what's the user want to do. Does the user want to compute the reception charges? Does the user want to reset all the components of the reception plan and start over? Or does the user want to exit the program? So we have to figure out in this logic which button was clicked and then invoke the appropriate method of reception plan. The iDo catering GUI, okay, this also is going to define a data member that holds a reference to the reception plan object. Okay, view classes hold references to their model objects. Eventually it's going to hold a reference to all of its constituent panels, and there will be three of them, but for this one it's only going to have one, so we're going to partially implement that. We're going to define a constructor that creates and populates the overall GUI, meaning it'll create an instance of the actions panel and populate it, and it's going to define a method. And this is the method that's going to initiate the update of the display. We're going to just define one method called update. And it's going to have a single parameter that's going to tell the GUI class what needs updated. And there are going to be two possibilities. The parameter action could have the value reset. And if it has the value reset, then it's going to invoke an appropriate method of each of the constituent J panels. Okay, so it's got to have to reset the guest panel. It's going to have to reset the reception packages panel. It's going to have to reset the receptions options panel. It's going to have to reset the reception charges panel. So it's basically going to have to ensure that the entire window gets reset to the same state it was in when the program was launched. The other possibility here is that action can have the value update. And if that's true, then what needs updated is the charges panel, because this means that the user has constructed his or her reception plan and now wants to know how much it costs. So he's initiated the calculation of the costs, and now those need to be displayed. The final class we're going to implement is the iDo catering driver. And that class is going to define a main method to instantiate a reception plan and then use that instance to instantiate an iDo catering GUI. So at the top inside the main method, this class is responsible for creating the two major objects and gluing them together. So let's take a look now at what GUI requirements are addressed and what technical requirements are addressed. Well, from the assignment, we're going to be addressing what happens with events that come from the actions panel. So whenever the apply button is clicked, it says that the program must calculate all charges as specified in the functional requirements and then populate the charges GUI component. Well, we're not going to go quite that far. For this iteration, what we're going to do is create a placeholder method in the reception plan class, and all it's going to do is notify the iDo catering GUI of the need to update the display. And then we're going to create the update method in the iDo catering GUI that this reception plan method is going to invoke. And it's just going to simulate the update of the display by displaying a console message. And we're going to have real simple text, apply requested. So that way we will know that the communication is good between the user interface and that event that's captured by a controller. That goes to the model, and the model goes back to the view. So we'll make sure that that path is sound. Similarly, whenever the reset button is clicked, the program's supposed to return the GUI to its initial state. And program objects, that is model objects used for recording those user selections, must also be properly initialized. So again, what we're going to do is create a placeholder method in reception plan. It's not going to do any initialization or reinitialization of its data members. All it's going to do is notify the iDo catering GUI of the need to update display. That is, everything needs to be reinitialized. Again, we're not going to create a new update method in iDo catering GUI. What we're going to do is utilize that method that we created above, and this time it's going to display the message reset requested. Okay, so that update method that we referred to on the previous slide is going to do double duty. It's basically going to be responsible for initiating any updates that we need on the GUI. And which update we need to do is going to be determined by the value of that parameter action. Finally, whenever the exit button is clicked, the program must terminate execution. So we're going to fully implement that requirement. As far as technical requirements go, well, this tells us that the iDo catering GUI has to be a subclass of JFrame. So we know it has to extend the JFrame subclass. It has to be configured with the border layout manager. It has to comprise of 3 panels, but since we're only going to implement the actions panel, that's the only one we're going to address here. Its dimensions must be 680 by 300, and it must be titled iDo Catering Service Reception Cost Estimator. So we are going to address all of those technical requirements, and the third one just partially. For the actions panel and the actions event listener, we're going to address all the technical requirements. Okay, now that we've kind of reviewed our approach to iteration 1, we can now go over to Eclipse and actually develop the code. Welcome back to the cs161 programming tutorial. Okay, we've covered the design of iteration 1 and reviewed the requirements that we're going to address. Now I brought up the Java Eclipse app, and we're going to begin developing the code. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a project, and we're just going to call this one cs161 tutorial project 1. Now, we said we were going to implement several classes here, and what I'm going to do right at the beginning, I'm going to simply create all those classes, and then we'll go back and populate them. So we'll create the first class. We'll do the driver. And I'm going to put everything in a package. And we're going to generate the main method here. So I'll have Eclipse do that. And then we said we were going to generate our model class reception plan. So we'll do that. We will generate one of our view classes, actions panel. We'll generate the iDo catering GUI. And then the last class we said as a requirement needs to be an inner class of the actions panel. So we'll go there and we'll define that. And it has to implement the action listener interface. Okay, and then we'll let Eclipse do our imports for us. And we'll also have Eclipse, since we are implementing an interface, we have to implement the methods associated with that interface, and we'll let it add our header. Alright, so there we go. Okay, so the most complex part of code development for this iteration is right here in the Actions panel. So the Actions panel here, the first thing it needs to do, it needs to be a subclass of JPanel. So we have to say that it extends JPanel. And again, we'll let Eclipse import that for us. Well, then what do we need? All right, we know it's got to consist of 3 J buttons, and we know it has to have a reference to the model class, that is to reception plan. So we'll put those declarations here. And we know they're all Java Swing buttons. And I'm just going to name them with the same name I'm going to use on the labels. I'll duplicate here. So we have an apply button, we have a reset button, and we have an exit button. And again, we're going to have to import JButton. We also need a reference to the reception plan class. I'll call that plan. And I'm also going to create a reference to, since we're going to have to create an instance of our event listener here. Just call the EL for event listener. All right, so those are our data members. Okay, and then we'll have a constructor, and the constructor is going to do all the work of building the actions panel. And we need to configure the actions panel with an instance of the reception plan. So who's ever going to invoke actions panel is going to send to actions panel an instance of the receptions plan. So that'll be our single argument. And then the first thing we'll do is store that. And since the argument is the same name as our data member, I have to use this to distinguish between the argument and the data member. Now if we look at the panel, the GUI panel has a border around it, and the border has a title actions. Okay, so JPanel has a method called setBorder. So I inherit that from JPanel. And then I have to use the Java class border factory to create myself a title border. And I want for the title to be actions. This is required to have a flow layout. So I'm going to set the layout. to a new flow layout. And we'll have Eclipse import that. All right, now let's create our button components here. And all three of them are created in the same way. So I'll do another copy and paste. And then we'll go ahead and label them appropriately. All right, so we've created them. Now I'm going to configure them with an appropriate action listener. So we will create our action listener. And then add that same action listener to each of the buttons. Add action listener. Okay. All right, so we created our buttons, configured them with an action listener. Now let's add those buttons to the panel. And remember, the flow out, the order in which you add them, left to right, is the order in which they're going to appear in the J panel. So applies first, reset second, exit is third. Okay, so that takes care of creating our GUI. Now what we need to go down here is finish up the logic for our action listener. All right, so we said that each of the buttons is going to generate an event, and that event is going to end up at the same action listener, meaning whenever a button's clicked, this action perform method is going to be invoked on the same instance of the action event listener. So in here, we have to figure out which button was clicked. Well, it turns out that the parameter here can help us. I'm going to change this from arg0 to E for event. And I'm going to query that event. And I'm going to ask that action event, what was your source? That is, what caused you to be created? And that's going to be the object that created it. Okay. So what objects do we have that could have created it? Well, it's going to be one of the button objects. So we're going to get the object variable. So if it's the apply object, right, then what we're going to do is we're going to invoke a method of the reception plan. I haven't defined that method yet. So for the moment, leave that blank. So if it's equal to our button reset, we're going to do something else. Well, we know what the only other option is, but I'm going to explicitly put it here. And here we're just going to exit the application. All right, so we're almost done with this. But we need to go over to reception plan, and we got to fill it up a little bit. But not a whole lot. There's not a whole lot we're going to do over here. The reception plan, one of the things we know is it must hold a reference to its view. I'm just going to call that the GUI. Then what we're going to do is we have to define a way for it to be configured. Now, this could be configured either via a constructor, or we can configure it by doing what we do to other private data members when we want to assign values to them. We can define a setter for it. And that's the approach I'm going to take here. So I'm going to just define a set, and all that's going to do is make a simple assignment. Now I'm going to do two other things here. I'm going to create those placeholder methods. One for when the user says, hey, I want to know what those reception charges are. So the reception plan is responsible for calculating the reception charges. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to name that after the button that's going to be pressed that will launch that. I'm going to do the same thing for the reset. Now, what needs to happen here is we said, look, these are simply going to be placeholders. They're not going to do any calculations, aren't going to do any changes to the reception plan. But what they are going to do is they have to notify the iDo catering GUI that it needs to update the display. So both apply and reset are going to have to invoke a method of the iDo catering GUI. We haven't defined that yet. So what I'm going to do now is just go over to the iDo catering GUI, and I'm going to add that. We know what it is. We said what we were going to do. We said we were going to define, right, a method called update, and it was going to have a single parameter called action. And that action was either going to be apply or it was going to be reset. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to implement that. And I could use an if statement, but I'm going to just switch it up, use a case statement. All right, so what can this be? It could either be apply syntax error there. If it's apply, then remember we're just going to fake this with console output just to make sure everything is glued together correctly. Apply requested. That's it. The other case is that it could be reset. And in this case, very similar logic. reset requested. Oh, I got a little problem here, don't I? Yeah, I forgot to set up my workspace properly. All right, there we go. Now it compiles correctly. Okay, now we can go back and we can complete our reception plan by invoking update here and saying, look, this update is associated with apply. And this update is associated with reset. And now that we've implemented these two methods, we can go back to our actions panel and finish this logic off. Okay, if you've clicked the apply button, then we're going to invoke apply on the reception. If you've invoked reset, then we're going to invoke reset on the plan. All right, so you're starting to get how this is fitting together. Okay, we create this button. Let's look at apply. We create the apply button. We configure it with our listener. Okay, so the user clicks apply. The action perform method gets invoked on our controller. The controller figures out the source of that click. Says, okay, you click the apply button. That implies now I've got to make some changes to the model. How do I make those changes? I ask the model to make those changes. All right, so let's go over to the model. Here's our model. The model's going to do some calculations in here. So the model's changed, so it needs to tell the GUI now, you need to update so the user can see those changes on the display. So we ask the view, hey, you need to do an update. What kind of update do you need to do? You need to update those parts of the GUI that are associated with this apply, these apply changes. All right, so we go over here. Now we go in update. All right, what happened? What do you need me to update? Oh, take a look at action. Is it apply? Yes. Then let's print out apply requested. Or, as we'll see later, we'll update the associated GUI, real GUI components. Okay, so we're getting there. Okay, now let's work on the GUI. Right, so this is the overall the class that's responsible overall for the GUI. So it extends JFrame. And we're going to have to bring that in. And then what do we need? Okay. Well, one of the things it's going to have is it's responsible for managing its three major panels. The guest panel, then the services panel, then underneath that is the actions panel. So the only one we're addressing here is the actions one. All right, so what do we need to do with this one? Well, all the activity is going to be done in the constructor. Okay. So we need to send this constructor an instance of the reception plan because its view components need to have access to the plan, okay, to the model, so it can figure out how to get the values it needs to update the display components. Right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the properties of the iDo Catering GUI J-frame. We'll first set the size. Now it says in the requirements that the size should be 680 by 300. Now what's very common when you deal with GUIs is, the sizes may change. You may add components, you may add additional panels, you may change the size of those components. So it's always a good idea, instead of using what we refer to as these magic numbers, let's go ahead and define a couple of named constants for the width and the height. So let's do our window width of 680 and the same thing for the height. And then we'll replace our magic numbers by those named constants. Let's now set the title. Again, following the requirements, the title has to be iDo Catering Service Reception Cost Estimator, and iDo must be in quotes. So we'll have to escape that. Alright, set the size, set the title. Now let's configure it with the appropriate layout manager. And again, from the requirements, the layout manager must be a border layout. We'll ask Eclipse to import that class. And then we'll also, and this is very common, we'll set the default close operation. To exit. What that means is when the GUI window is displayed, if the user clicks on the X on the border of the window, the application will terminate. Okay, now that we've done that, we can add our GUI components to the J-frame. And the only one we have here is the Actions panel. So we'll instantiate it. And we need to add that to the frame. And we're going to add that. Let's see, we got a border layout. It's at the bottom of the window in the border layout. The bottom area is the south component. And then we'll tell the plan that the view you're supposed to communicate with is this one. Now I notice I got a red squiggly up here. I notice, well, the Actions panel, that's also a view component, and it needs to know what its model component is. So we need to send it the plan. The final action we need to take here is when our main window is all set up, it's all configured, it's all populated, we need to make it visible. So now we have completed the construction of our main window. The last thing we need to do is go back and finish up the driver. The driver is very simple. It's going to create an instance of our model. And then it's going to hand over control to the instance of the main GUI. There we go. Okay, now we've created all the code. It compiled cleanly. Now we're going to test it. All right, here the window comes up. We'll see that it's appropriately titled. We'll see that we do have the actions panel here. And now we're going to test each of these buttons. So let's test the exit button first. Okay, see the program terminates, the window goes away. That is the expected behavior. Now let's try the reset button. Now I want you to note when the reset button is clicked, down here in the console window we get reset requested, which is the behavior we expected. So we expected that the click would be caught by the actions listener, and then that would invoke the appropriate method on our model, which was the reset method, and the reset method would then invoke update on our catering GUI, which would then delegate eventually to the appropriate panel. But here we said it's just going to send a message out to the console. So that works appropriately. Now we'll test apply. And down here we see that we get the appropriate message. Okay, so now we know that we have set up our initial model view controller architecture correctly. We got our main window. We know that we have set up in that main window one of its panels. We know that panel has an appropriate listener. We know that listener handles the 3 events correctly, that is, communicates to the model the reception plan. We know then that reception plan correctly communicates to the GUI, and then the GUI appropriately updates the display components, and in this case it was just the console. All right, so we're on our way. So the remaining 4 iterations will simply add functionality to this GUI.